і червона калина похилилася. Чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. Не хилися, червона калино, маєш білий цвіт. Не журися, славна Україно, маєш вільний рід. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. А ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо.
Гей, у полі ярої пшениці золотистий лав, розпочали стрільці українські з ворогами там. А ми тую ярою пшеницю і зберемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. А ми тую ярою пшеницю і зберемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. Як повіє буйнесенький вітер широких степів, та й прославить по всій Україні січових стрільців. А ми тую стрілецьку славу збережемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. А ми тую стрілецьку славу збережемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. А ми тую стрілецьку славу збережемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Прийшли окупанти до нас в Україну, форма новенька, воєнні машини, та трохи поплавився їх інвентар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Російські танкісти сховались в кущі, щоб лаптем посьорбати довбані щі, та трохи у чах перегрівся навар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Приперли зі сходу до нас барани для восстановлення
великої страны.
Найкращий пастух баранячих отар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Їх доводи всяке озброєння різне, потужні ракети, машини залізні. У нас на всі доводи є коментар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Вони захопити хотіли нас зразу, а ми зачаїли на орків образу з російських бандитів. Робить примар. Байрактар, Байрактар. Українська поліція справи заводить, там вбивцю рашистів ніяк не знаходить. Хто винен, що в нашому полі глухар? Байрактар. Байрактар. Веде пропаганду кремлівський урод. Слова пропаганди ковтає народ. Тепер нове слово знає цар.
Байрактар.
Байрактар. Байрактар.
Байрактар.
Байрактар.
Hello, everyone. I'm the Enforcer, and I'm accompanied by Enforcer Matt.
Hello, everybody.
And tonight we are here to report on the Day 90 news. And with that, the chapter has been closed on the third month of this war. And once again, the Ukrainians have held the line and are holding the Russians back. 3 months into what was supposed to be a 3-day war. At this point, the war is 100 times longer than what the Russians originally anticipated. That may be actually a little bit of a stretch when I think about it. 10 times longer would be a more appropriate number. But still, the fact of the matter is that the Ukrainians have completely blown away the Russians' plans to have a very swift and quick kind of blitzkrieg, much like they did in the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And this war started to turn into a terrible quagmire for the Russians, where they're really not seeing any options out. And based off of our news today, it appears that the Russians are nearly on the brink of running out of equipment. And we'll be covering that later on in the stream tonight in the Location Unknown segment. So make sure to stick around for that news, because it is insane and it is hilarious that they're actually having to go to the links that we've seen tonight. So, without any further ado, let me talk about what happened on Sunday. We had Operator Starsky and Funker530 on the stream actually Ronnie Fit from Funker530 on the stream this Sunday, and it was a pretty fun stream. I enjoyed it a lot. Of course, the Operator Starsky is always fun to have around, and Ronnie was a pretty new addition, and so he was also a fun guest to have around on Sunday, and we managed to blow through our $30,000 goal on the fundraiser for Revive Soldiers for Ukraine, and not only that, we even went $4,000 over our mark. That is honestly impressive to me, and it's unbelievable to think that even with the Lee Spring Army being as I guess you could say, worn out as it is, considering that we've been doing this for about 10 or 11 weeks at this point, and that we were still able to pull through and even go beyond our fundraising goal, was unbelievable to me. And I'm massively impressed, and I congratulate every single one of y'all. So give a huge round of applause to all of y'all in the chat, because y'all did an incredible job once again pulling through for the fundraiser and also getting Ukrainian soldiers help that they will actually be getting on the ground. We know that Revived Soldiers of Ukraine actually helped out one of Operator Starsky's friends that was in his unit that got shot in the head in 2019, and through the help of Revived Soldiers of Ukraine, he managed to survive. And so I have to say, once again, I thank you all so much. We've managed to raise nearly $300,000 in support of Ukraine through multiple nonprofits, and it's honestly, to me, absolutely unbelievable. And so I thank you all once again. It's an impressive thing that we're able to pull through and get this much help. And I actually saw a video today of a Swiss filmmaker when I was going through and trying to find my location unknown news, and he was being praised for raising $50,000, and I think I'm going to try and get the word out about my impressive and wonderful community here in the Leaf Spring Army, and talk about how much help all of us have been able to get and pull through with, like folks like William Allen, Naria, Paolo Corradini, among many others. I mean, like, there's countless of y'all that have been helping out with us, and it's honestly absolutely unbelievable. And I can't thank y'all enough. It's unbelievable to me that we're able to get this kind of help. And so, without harping on that too much and doting on y'all until it's like sappy, we're now going to get on into tonight's schedule. We don't have any news to speak of from the Kyiv area today. The only thing we have is the speech from President Zelensky that occurred today. He also commemorated the end of the 3rd month of the fighting and the beginning of the 4th month of the war, which is honestly very impressive when you actually sit back and think about it. So we'll actually be starting off within the location unknowns today. We'll start off on day 89 up here, which is in blue, and then moving on to day 90, which is in dark gray. And just for those of y'all who may be new or may not understand the coloring system here on this map, up here in the top left corner of the screen is actually the name of the map, the day that this war is in, and it also goes through all of the other colors and legends on the map. So, for example, what do the purple lines represent? What do the blue lines represent? What do the red represent? All that's up there in the legend. And if you want to take a very good look at this map and actually see it for yourself even better, there is a link in the description below to the Day 90 map, and you can check that out. So just letting all of y'all know, so that way if the symbols on the map are a little bit confusing, there is actually a guide I have written up here in the top left corner. It's been here the whole time, and I get a lot of questions about that, so I just wanted to clear it up. So we'll be covering our location unknowns. We will then be moving into Russia. So we'll kind of be doing this backwards today. We'll do location unknowns first and then go to Russia. And I'll be showing something interesting that occurred on Russian state TV today. We'll then be traveling back from Russia back down to the Kharkiv area. But before we get there, we're going to answer 3 questions from the chat. We're then going to move into the Kharkiv area. We're then going to cover the northern part of the Donbass. So we'll actually be taking a stop before we reach Svitlodarsk. We'll answer 3 questions from the chat in between the area of Popasna and Svitlodarsk. Once we answer those 3 questions, we'll then cover the rest of the news around the country that's occurred over the past 48 hours, and then we'll wrap up tonight's news with a speech from President Zelensky, and then go into the question segment and answer everyone's questions that's sent in the super chat. Once again, just a reminder, everyone, sending in the super chat does support this channel. While we can answer questions, the primary goal of the super chats is to support the channel. So that's why sometimes, because I think it's kind of been lost as well, and I don't want to get into an aside on this stuff too much, but some people think that the super chats are being sent in to ask a question, and while you can ask a question, I'll most likely be able to give an answer. Super chats are just really to support the channel and keep us running, but I will make sure to answer your question if you have one, because I do want to make sure that y'all get something out of supporting the channel. And if you want to support Ukraine, and I just want to make this clear, come back for the Sunday fundraisers, or click on the link in the description below where you can go and support nonprofits that are currently operating in Ukraine. And so, with that all out of the way, let's get into the news today. And we have a lot of it over the past 48 hours. Starting off on day 89, we can see that a major general was killed. Surprisingly, major generals in the Russian Air Force still take flight in aircraft. This isn't unheard of in wars. Actually, General Eisenhower hopped into a modified P-51, I believe during the Battle of Sanlo, I believe he actually flew over the city in a P-51, which is a crazy story. I think you can actually check that one out on Mark Felton's channel. But we can see here that Ukrainian paratroopers have apparently shot down this major general called Kanamat Bodashev. Apparently over Luhansk. He was in an Su-25 supposedly, and here's a picture of the burning wreckage in the distance that major general would have been in. At the moment, I believe it has been confirmed, although this post was 2 days ago and the information wasn't hardcore yet. Apparently, he was actually in the plane, and it was confirmed that they had killed another major general in one of the weirdest of circumstances. And so, huge blow to morale for the Russians once again, as another general has been killed. And it's, of course, impressive and amazing to know that the Ukrainians have killed more generals, well, almost as many generals now as the United States lost over about the halfway point of World War II. So that's really crazy to me that they're losing so many of their top brass, and that's, of course, very hard to replace. And so we're now going to move on to our next bit of location unknown news, where we can see the Georgian Legion, which is a group of volunteers from the nation of Georgia that are fighting in Ukraine, and also Ukrainian artillery attacking Russian units. Of course, always great to see. Let me get this up on screen. And while it is a little bit grainy, we can make out a couple of things. We can see the smoldering wreckage of a couple of Russian vehicles near this tree line. One of them still is having ammunition cook-off. And we can also see some other kind of vehicle, although we can't identify what it is, over here on the left side of the screen where my mouse is circling. We can see that the fire still rages on the second vehicle in this convoy. That appears to actually be a KAMAZ, now that we got a good look at that truck. So we're not sure what the first two were, but this is certainly a KAMAZ truck. We can also see what appears to be a little fella there who looks like he's gone to sleep. And we can now see that this tank is still brewing up. I think that's actually a tank. It looks like some kind of BMP, but we can tell that this was a Ural 4320. So it looks like it was largely supplies that were destroyed or abandoned. And of course, great to know, the Russians rely on supplies just like every other army to function, and if you deprive the combat units of supplies, you are depriving the military of the function to continue on fighting. And so it's great to see that the Ukrainians are still interdicting supplies going to Russian units. And so in the next clip, we can actually see probably one of the most impressive artillery shots in the war from the story I heard. We're not really sure what artillery piece fired this shot, but this was fired by the 128th Artillery Brigade, and from what we were able to hear story-wise, is that this was the first shot fired by this artillery piece, so I guess you could call it the ranging shot, if you would like to, and it was fired from 20 kilometers away. And just for my American viewers who don't know what 20 kilometers is, let's put 20 kilometers to miles. And so this was a 12.4 mile shot that they fired, and it was the first one out of this artillery piece, so they were kind of guessworking where the shell would land. And in this clip, you can see the artillery shell hit dead on to the Russian vehicle. Now, that is insane. This is probably a stretch, but this is the first time I've ever seen on film such a long-range shot actually hit on the first one. This is almost impossible. It's insane that this level of accuracy has been achieved by Ukrainian artillery. I'm not sure if it was a fluke or not, but this is incredible nonetheless, and amazing to know that this was actually caught on film. You can actually see that Russian vehicle right there in the tree. You can see the artillery shell actually fly in for a second. You can see it right there. Actually, nope, correction. Let's go back for a second. You can see it right there. And it flies in straight onto that vehicle, and it explodes and destroys it. It is unbelievable to think that Russian crew had absolutely no warning. There was no shot that landed nearby for them to adjust off of, and then the Russians, would have time to abandon the vehicle. That shot hit dead on from 12.4 miles away. 20 kilometers away. That is the equivalent of a Chris Kyle sniper level artillery unit to hit a shot like that from that distance on the first round. So once again, huge kudos to the Ukrainian artillery. They are going above and beyond the levels of accuracy and excellence that is usually expected out of an artillery unit. And it's unbelievable the feats that they've accomplished with their artillery. They are setting new bars and new standards around the world for what accurate artillery fire is. So we're now going to move on to the last bit of news that we've gotten from day 89, which of course is a Stugna attack. Everyone loves them, everyone can't get enough of them, and I can never find too few of them. And so here's a video of a Stugna attacking a Russian vehicle that's moving through an open plain. It appears that it may actually have infantry sitting on the back of the vehicle. It looks like it may be an MTLB. of a sort. We can now see that the Stugna is on the way. Let me see if it has music. It doesn't have music.
Блять, сховається воно.
We can see the Stugna is still traveling.
Блять, воно ховається, сука. Щось установку трясе на.
And a direct hit.
Въебал, сука. Снимай. Въебал. Поїхала горяща, вон нахуй. Хмара, є пульт, ціль уражена, ще одна. Їж, сука.
You would think after 3 months of wiping out Russian vehicles with Stugnas, the Ukrainian crews that operate these anti-tank weapons would be less energetic about wiping out another Russian vehicle, but every time they take one out, they have the same energy and enthusiasm that they had when the first shot hit in the first days of the war, and that tells you a lot about the morale. They are more than happy to continue on this fight. They have never lost the vision or the image or the spirit that they had within the first days of the war, and they continue on every single day fighting like it was the first one. And so that's incredibly impressive from a morale standpoint, that they are still as energetic and excited now as they were at the start, and that they're still wiping out Russian vehicles with these Stugnas. You would think that the Russians would have at least tried to develop some kind of new strategy to try and make sure that they could mitigate their losses from the Stugnas, but we've never seen that. We've hardly seen them develop any new strategies over 3 months of fighting. That's a typical Russian thing. Just letting y'all know, historically, they never really changed their strategies. The only time they did was in World War II, and that was usually attributed to the massive amount of losses that they took. But we can see here that they haven't learned a thing, and the Ukrainians, of course, are taking advantage of it. Let's listen to that happy little cheer they gave out at the end, because I love hearing that. It's great to hear them so excited that they're still managing to take out the Russian units.
Въебал, сука. Снимай. Въебал. Поїхала горяща, вон нахуй. Хмара, є пульт, ціль уражена, ще одна. Їж, сука.
And they are happy, and I gotta say, I don't know about y'all, but that makes me pretty hyped up just to hear them being hyped up about knocking out another Russian vehicle. And so with that, we've actually run out of day 89 news, and so we're now going to move on to day 90, and we have loads of news from day 90. Just to let y'all know, during days 88 and 89, there was actually a little bit of an information drop. There wasn't a lot of information coming out of Ukraine anymore as far as video evidence, and it was very, very hard for me actually to come up with all of the news I covered on day 88 with the guest speakers on. It was incredibly hard to find that. But as of day 90, it looks like the information is coming back out in a large stream, and there's a lot of it available. So that's why we have a large lack of news for day 89, because it was kind of falling under that same failing that day 88 had. So hopefully that doesn't happen again, because it does make it a little bit more difficult to assess the situation. And so we're now going to be moving on to day 90. And starting off on day 90, I have to say this. While the front line is, of course, still developing, and in some areas as of today, it appears that the Russians have still managed to make a little bit of ground in places here and there, mostly near Lyman, which we'll cover later on today. The Ukrainians have won this war, and while that sounds very biased and pro-propaganda and all that kind of stuff, you know, I'm sure people are going to start saying that in the chat. Hear me out. Because the Russians have lost so many tanks over the course of this war, and most of them are the best tanks in the Russian army, just letting y'all remember that. While a lot of people think the T-14 Armata, the T-9DM, and other vehicles like that are, you know, commonplace, they're not. The most modern tanks that the Russians have are T-80 BVMs and T-72s. So most of that stuff was developed in the 70s and has just been upgraded to try and keep up to modern standards. And so much of that has been destroyed that we now see the Russians pulling out stuff from the Far East that no one's seen since the 80s or the late 70s. Here we can see, loaded onto train cars, being prepared to move to Ukraine, T-62s. T-62s. You cannot make this stuff up. And this is actually being loaded and being prepared to be sent to Ukraine. And a lot of y'all are probably wondering, because some of y'all, you know, of course, and this is fine, don't know a lot about armor. And so you're like, well, what is a T-62? I mean, like, you're telling me it's old, but how old really? And that's a great question. The T-62 is incredibly old. I mean, like, if we go through here and actually look at when it was produced and made, according to Wikipedia, it was put into service in 1961. And while it's in service with some countries till the present day, most of these countries are incredibly poor and have never had the ability to buy new tanks. these things are some of the most dated tanks that you could ever imagine being used. They're also incredibly expensive, even at the time when they were produced, and so there's very few parts for them. They're kind of a rare feature. And so you can see a picture of one here. Of course, the Russian ones in this picture do appear to have some ERA tiles on them, most likely some kind of Contact 1, which is one of the most primitive and oldest forms of ERA armor possible. But still, just to give you an idea of how old these things are, when the Soviet Union started producing and using T-62s, the United States was still using M48s. To give y'all a perspective of how old the M48 is, that was put into service in 1952. So this gives you a great idea of how far the United States has gone while the Soviet Union and now the Russians have stayed behind. This would be like the United States pulling these tanks out, which are dated by all measures, and using them in the invasion of Iraq in 2003 or in Afghanistan. That's how primitive a T-62 is. And yet we see the Russians having to pull these things out of their eastern supply depots because they're so hard-pressed for modern armor now that this is the best they have. And this tells you that they've won. This is 100%. The Ukrainians have won at this point. Their armor has now been depleted. They're going to bring in stuff that's so old it may as well be useless. And the Ukrainians are going to start wiping this stuff off the map even quicker than they've been wiping out the modern Russian units. And so I just got to say, I can't believe, honestly, that this is the state of the Russian army, that we're actually seeing them pull out this kind of stuff. So with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news. And remember, keep that in mind, those units are probably going to start hitting the front lines within 2 weeks' time. And so we're now going to move on to the next bit of news, where we can see that the French SPG, the Caesar, has finally arrived on the front lines for Ukraine. The Caesar uses a 155mm gun, much like the M777, but the Caesar can be set up in a much quicker time than the M777, and it also has a farther range, which does make it a lot more efficient and more, I guess you could say, safe to use than even the M777, which has a load of advantages over Soviet artillery pieces that the Ukrainians have been using. So the Ukrainians have gotten an upgrade to their upgrade, practically. Here we can see the inside of a Caesar, and you can actually see how advanced the Caesar is compared to most stuff we've been seeing used. It actually has like a pretty up-to-date modern LCD screen in it, so that's really cool. We can also see them setting up the 155mm piece. You can see the back plate to it that, of course, keeps the truck stable and not being kicked around by the fire of the gun. And we can see another picture of it being set up. The Caesar can fire incredibly quickly, and it can also be unloaded and loaded incredibly quickly within a matter of like 20 seconds, I believe. So this is the epitome and perfection, I guess you could say, on the modern battlefield of the shoot and scoot kind of method. And it's going to be a lot easier for the Ukrainians to avoid counterfire with this system and also lay down a load of fire. Hopefully the Ukrainians will be getting more Western gear like the Panzerhaubitze 2000 in the future, but right now the Caesar is here, and the Caesar will stay. So great to see. It's wonderful to know that the Ukrainians are getting even better equipment as time goes on. And we're now going to move on to our next bit of news, where we can see a Switchblade drone in use. We haven't seen anything about the Ghost drone, sadly. We actually answered that on Sunday. None of us had seen anything about it. But we can see that the Ukrainians are still using Switchblades, and I gotta say, that's pretty good on its own. And so here's the video of a Switchblade being used. Here we can see some footage from a drone taking a look at a Russian position. It appears to be a small bunker here in the distance. And we can now see footage from what I'm assuming is the Switchblade drone. So now it's switched back to the DJI Mavic, it seems. And we're waiting for that Switchblade drone to hit. And it's now hit and exploded dead onto the Russian position. So now we can see the footage from the Switchblade flying right into it. Actually, correction. That is a T-72B3 they just flew that thing into. You can actually see the crew right there looking up at it, and they're probably thinking, oh no, this is not good. And actually all three of them are there. Not a single one of them's inside the tank. There's the commander, the gunner, and also the driver, all right here on the side of the tank where the Switchblade hit. So, to suffice it to say, the Ukrainians just got a free tank, and the crew didn't abandon the tank. They must have gotten vaporized outside of it by the Switchblade. And so the footage cuts off there. And you can see that they're now playing the, of course, like Curb Your Enthusiasm music. But that's, that's actually kind of weird when you really think about it and look at this footage. Let's take a look at that one more time. That crew knows they're dead. They're looking up at their death right there. And we're watching on footage, hours after it happened, these soldiers knowing that their time has come. And when you really think about that, that's actually kind of eerie in a way. And I wonder if that's gone through the mind of the Switchblade operator. that flew that drone in and thought, they actually looked up and saw their death for a second and actually knew it was coming. Because when you really think about that, while it's of course great to know that they're destroying Russian units and such, that is kind of weird. And it would actually make me think a little bit at night if I actually was the guy flying that Switchblade. But still, that Ukrainian soldier need not worry. He is defending his homeland, and this is what you have to do when trying to push the Russians out of a country that they've invaded. So, just got to say, of course, incredibly impressive that the Switchblades are being used. We don't know about the Phoenix Ghost, but the Switchblades, nonetheless, are doing an incredible job. And so we're now going to move on to the next bit of Location Unknown News, where we can see a ATV with a Stugna on top, and we can actually see how the Ukrainians are using this fine piece of kit. Here we can see them driving a Ford. Gotta say, it looks like the Ukrainians love the Ford. Nothing wrong with it. And we can see that they've got it pretty kitted out, honestly. It's pretty rigged. We can now see them throwing up a javelin, and it looks like an in-law as well. They're using the two Western, like, prodigies, I guess you could say, of anti-tank guided missile, like shoulder-mounted anti-tank guided missiles, the in-law and the javelin at the same time. We can now see them preparing to fire. Of course, this looks like a little bit of a shoot just to show how it's used. We can now see them talking about the javelin anti-tank missile system, and we can now see the tank get hit by the mine, a tank burning. We can see another tank get hit. I think that one may have been by a Stugna. And we can now see them showing off the CLU, it seemed, of the javelin. Let me make sure. Yeah, that is the CLU. And we can also see the javelin tube over there. And with that, the video ended. And so it's really interesting to see the, I guess you could say, improvised route. While it's improvised, it's not looking terrible either, which is telling us that the Ukrainians are actually having a pretty decent amount of funds and supplies to keep on fielding these units with. And that's really interesting to me because we're seeing that the Ukrainians are kind of developing the technical even further than what we've seen before, and it's now becoming more modernized with its equipment and also the vehicles they're using. So very interesting to see. And we're now going to move on to the next bit of Location Unknown News, where we can see some reminders of peace. And I thought this was kind of cute, so I threw it into the video so that way we'd have a little bit of a break from the war. And we can see in this town that's been under some shelling day after day that a rooster has brought out its hens to eat. And so it's a nice little video, so I'm just going to let y'all see it and be quiet so that way we can enjoy just the sounds of the chickens and the rooster.
Look at that big friggin' rooster in the back. Come to daddy. Look at that big rooster in the back. Come to daddy.
And so right there at the end of the video, you can actually see the damage from the shelling that's been occurring on this village. But it was a very nice video to see, a little reprieve from the war in a way. And I bet you that's just a nice scene for anyone to see, you know, in the middle of all this fighting and bombardments, to pass through a quiet village and just see some chickens out, you know, just eating. It's a simple scene. But, you know, the simple stuff is always the nicest stuff to see when you're going through hell on earth, you know, because it's just a little bit of a reprieve. And so we're now going to move on to the next bit of Location Unknown News, where we can see some Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines. Here we can see them give a little speech. I'm not going to interrupt it. I'm just going to let it play. And so here is the video.
Територіальної оборони. Зараз іде війна. Дуже тяжко всім. І нам тяжко. Ми сюди заходили, в це місто, під обстрілами. Тому ми знаємо, що таке війна. Це не прогулянка, це не поход. Звертаємось до всіх батальйонів. Хлопці, згуртуйтеся всі. Ми повинні тримати нашу країну, відбивати наші території і прогнати цю нечисть з нашої країни. Ми стаємо друг за другом, допомагаємо друг другу. І я надіюсь, що так будуть поступати кожен з нас. Я впевнений в кожному бійці, який знаходиться разом зі мною, тому що ми друзі, товариші, брати. Тому, хлопці, згуртуємося всі і дамо цій нечисті під п'яту точку, щоб вони не лізли до нашої країни. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
And so at the end of that video, I want to sit here and talk about one of these guys' kits. And I know this is kind of like an opinion and a preference thing, but this guy over here on the far left, I gotta say, I like his kit. I like the shirt, I like the vest. I also like the helmet. The helmet looks like one of those old, I think it was called M-Latch helmet. I'm not really sure, that the United States used to use back in the Gulf War. And we can also see that he's got a pretty nice AK with a wooden stock and also a wooden foregrip on it. And I'm a huge fan of wooden, I guess you could say furniture on guns. I think it looks great. Polymers also are great too, but I'm just not much of a fan of them. But still, I gotta say, I love this guy's kit, just to throw in a little bit of my opinion there. So with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of Location Unknown news, where we see a Ukrainian frontline bunker. This is a cool little insight to how the Ukrainian soldiers live when they're resting on the front lines, because soldiers aren't always fighting, you know, they're always eventually rotated off the front lines. They're not always stuck there, you know, being shot at and having to shoot people. And so they are eventually given time to relax. So here we can see a bunker where Ukrainian soldiers are resting and relaxing.
Five stadia saltiv, da?
And so with the end of that video, we could see that while it does lack lighting, they do have a decent amount of what appears to be food on this table. And so we do know that the Ukrainian soldiers are still being well fed and well supplied at this point in the front lines, which is a good observation you can make from here. I'm not really sure what these are, if they're pickles or some kind of pickled vegetable. Couldn't really tell you for certain, but we can tell that they have a lot of them. And if they were lacking any of this other food, they could definitely just eat whatever's in that jar. And so that's the end of that video, but of course, a very interesting insight and a good look at how Ukrainian soldiers are living on those front lines. And so we're now going to move on to the next video, and it's World War I all over again. This is something I felt like you would see in reenacting, and I'm not sure if this is a Ukrainian bunker or one that the Ukrainians have captured from the Russians. But if it is a Ukrainian bunker, even if this stuff is dated, the Maxim is over 100 years old at this point, way older than that even. I gotta say, I'm a huge fan of this. It looks amazing. I would love to see this in real life. And so what we're seeing here is a wooden bunker. You know, it has wood, I guess you could say, clapboarding on the inside of it. And also a Maxim gun that's been mounted on top of sandbags. And this is the most World War I era-esque thing I've seen in the entirety of this war, with how the bunker is made, and also the 1910 Maxim, and it's in great condition. I mean, like, looking at this thing would fetch like $120,000 in the United States if this thing was to be sold. So I'm blown away by this thing. This almost seems like a relic, and while it is a little bit scary at times to think that the Ukrainians and the Russians are starting to use Maxims, you know, because they're kind of like pulling equipment out of the middle of nowhere at this point, it's still so cool to see such antiquated equipment being used, and it does have a place on the battlefield. I mean, like, the Maxim and the Vickers guns were pretty much known to never jam. I mean, like, the Vickers gun went through, my god, like millions of rounds. One of them did. I forgot, it was like in the 60s. They were trying to figure out how much can a Vickers shoot before it like breaks apart. And they fired 6 million rounds out of one Vickers non-stop. The only time they stopped was to replace the barrels, and also to change out the water, you know, so that way it wouldn't overheat. Well, I don't think they ever changed out the water, actually. Anyways, the only time I think they stopped was to change out the barrels. And that thing fired 6 million rounds. And when they took that Vickers gun apart, that thing was still in firing condition, had almost no wear on the inside of its mechanisms. And the Maxim was very similar to that. And so while they are incredibly old, 100 years or older at this point, they are still effective weapons in a way, and of course a bullet will kill, regardless of what weapon it comes from. And considering it is a machine gun in an in-place position, the Maxim is of course working to its strengths here, unlike if you were to put it on, say, a truck or a technical or something. So it's good to see. Well, it's not really good to see that such old equipment is being used, but it's really cool to see how old-fashioned this looks, because if I pulled up a World War I bunker, you wouldn't be able to tell a difference in between the two, because that's my niche in history, is World War I. And so seeing something like this, I'm like, oh my god, this is like World War I. And that's really cool, honestly, but, you know, kind of weird at the same time, considering we're in 2022, and it looks like World War I, which was over 100 years ago. We're now going to be moving on to the next bit of Location Unknown news, where we can see even more destroyed Russians. Here in this clip, we can see a soldier guiding us around some destroyed Russian vehicles.
До чого призводить водіння транспортного засобу в нетверезому стані.
What you're looking at right here, just to explain real quick, is actually a turret that's flipped upside down. You can actually see the teeth that the gears would actually rotate the turret with, and what's here in the center is actually the gun's breech. And so you're actually looking at a turret that's blown off of a tank and flipped upside down, just for y'all to know.
Засобу в нетверезому стані. Дивіться, от пили вони водку, русская сталь. Бачите? І ось результат. І ось наслідки. Русская сталь.
Oh, wait. Y'all remember this. I hope to God you do. Y'all remember when Starsky was talking about the Russian tankers are drunk? Look what they found. They found a vodka glass in the rubble. You can't make this stuff up. They're literally driving the tanks drunk. And also another thing for y'all to pull up, and I think this would be very, very great for y'all to get a context about, is that the Russians, it's not a stereotype, they actually have a serious problem with alcoholism inside of their country. People die from alcohol poisoning commonly inside of Russia compared to other countries around the world. And I highly suggest y'all pull up videos on that on YouTube, because a lot of people have actually taken deep dives into the history of alcohol in Russia and how it's kind of led to a bit of a decline, and led to the Russians actually falling behind just because of the mere fact of the addictive nature of alcohol inside of Russia. So make sure to go check that out. It's very interesting history. It has a lot to do with communism as well. At the time, like the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, because alcohol was actually considered at that time by the communists one of the ways that the czars held the Russians, I guess you could say, under their control, the Russian peasantry and stuff like that. Because by keeping them so drunk, and also vodka production was state-run at that time, so the czars had complete control over vodka production in the country, that when the Bolsheviks were taking over, alcohol was looked at as like one of the ways the bourgeoisie was controlling the proletariat. It's a very interesting history. It's very different from how it was around the rest of the world, and I highly recommend it. It's a very interesting insight into Russia's history with how alcohol has kind of shaped their entire culture, especially vodka. But with that, you can see vodka in the tank. Starsky was literally not lying. It's not propaganda. They are literally sauced.
90. Московський танк Т-90, щоб ніхто не сумнівався. Подивіться на оцю броню, на цей вигляд його башні. І коли кажуть там десь, що ось знищений лише один десь там Т-90, тільки ми спостерігали.
That tank that they were looking at was a T-80U, just for y'all to know.
Точно можемо підтвердити 4 знищених Т-90. Я підозрюю, що насправді їх знищено набагато більше. Навіть всередині не все згоріло. Не имеющий аналогов. Страшна московська зброя. Бачите, яка вона була страшна, а тепер зовсім не страшна. Оце московська САУ, яка теж поламалася.
We can now see a 2S3M. These are one of Russia's normal SPG forces. It has, I believe, a 155mm gun, but they are pretty dated. But still, usually artillery units like SPGs don't really have to be updated and upgraded too much, because the fact that they'd ever be used on the front lines is very laughable, to say the least. So.
Чомусь. Не знаю чому. Я думаю, що причина ось у цьому. Щось таке тут, щось прилетіло. Ось така ось сумна історія. Дивіться, московська САУ. От вона стояла ось тут вона стояла. Потім щось відбувається з нею.
We can also see the small little chunk of what used to be a Russian vehicle, but it seems that the rest of it has been atomized. So.
Ось її частина. Ось її ствол. А ось там далі, бачите, метрів за 100, оце двигун від неї. От.
Hey, look! I didn't notice that. There's a gun of whatever this thing was that was blown into shreds, and it's literally sticking up out of the plane. I think they ought to keep that there as a memorial, because that's really, really weird that they did that, and I think that would be a good, we can now see them dancing on top of the SPG.
Так банда танцює на криші саушки. Пан чорний вишиває.
Now I gotta say I gotta definitely say something about how the Ukrainians treat everything that they destroy. They treat every single small victory, which of course the small victories accumulate into large ones, but they treat every single Russian vehicle destroyed like a massive celebration. And that's great, because that's of course a wonderful way to keep up morale. And they have so many examples of destroying Russian units that they are pretty much out there living a continuous celebration at times, although in some places that's not the case, of course. But some Ukrainian soldiers are out there partying like they're back at home because of the amount of vehicles that they're destroying. And you can see they're having a pretty fun time with what they're doing. And while war is a terrible thing, and war is, of course, hell on earth for the most part, it seems that the Ukrainians are mitigating I guess you could say, sadness of the war a pretty decent deal by celebrating their achievements so well. So that's actually the end of the video right here. But wonderful to see, and it's great to know that the Ukrainians are, of course, managing to inflict massive Russian losses still. We're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see the Russians getting hit by a drone. It's dropping mortar rounds on them. Very interesting. So we'll see the drone here. And we can see a group of Russians over here. There's also a couple of Russians over here on this side of the street, but you can't see them. So we can now see the little mortar round get dropped. You can now see one of the Russians. He's right there where my mouse cursor is circling. And so they start running because they hear the mortar round falling onto him, just making like a whistling sound or whatnot. And so now you can see the bodies of the Russians after the mortar round exploded labeled here. And so now you know that they've been killed by this drone. So after that, we can now see that they've clipped forward to the Russians carrying the bodies of these dead Russians down the street. And they're trying to get them probably to some kind of well, there it is. They're trying to get them to the Ghostbusters van, and they're also trying to get them to the Chevy, the El Dorado Cadillac to try and get them out of there. And they've, of course, marked them heavily up with Z's. So I think that the Ghostbusters machine will definitely be making some ghosts, considering that's been marked with a Z very clearly. But we can now see them trying to load them into the civilian cars. And that's another interesting thing to note, is that they don't have any available ambulances, apparently, and that's why they're having to commandeer civilian vehicles to make up for this loss of, I guess you could say, actual military equipment. So we're now going to be moving on from that video into the next bit of Location Unknown news, where we can once again see another Czech RM-70 in action. Let me unmute this real quick, because of course we always got... Once again, the sound of an MLRS is indistinguishable at this point. We've heard it so many times, and we can see here again that the Ukrainians are using it again here on day 90. We're now going to move on to the next bit of Location Unknown news, where we can see incendiary rounds being used on the Ukrainians. Of course, one does have to make it clear every single time we do see this, that while this has been marked as a war crime, the use of incendiary rounds is a very tricky subject to cover, because it's actually legal under certain circumstances and not legal under others. If the Russians are able to confirm that there are only enemy combatants in this area, they can use incendiary rounds on those soldiers. But at the same time, they're supposed to be able to prove that the explosion of the incendiary round killed the soldiers and not the subsequent burning. And here in this video, you can see that they have, of course, committed a war crime, because any soldier that would be killed by this would be killed by the burning of the incendiary. So we can see all of the, I guess you could say, embers of the incendiary rounds falling to the ground. And hopefully all the Ukrainians have made it to cover and safety. So, of course, another instance of a Russian war crime. The Russians really have no problem with using incendiary rounds and committing war crimes in such a way. And considering that we're in the modern age, it's very barbaric to imagine burning other soldiers to death either by, a flamethrower, which we don't see any of those being used anymore, or incendiary rounds like this white phosphorus here. So, of course, incredibly unfortunate. Hopefully, Ukrainians did not get killed or injured by this incendiary round. And so we're now going to move on to our last bit of location unknown news, where we can see more pictures of Caesar SPGs arriving on the front lines. And unfortunately, that has been removed. And so we've actually covered all of our location unknowns for today, and we're now going to move to the only bit of news we got in Russia on day 89, and then we're going to move back down into Kharkiv. And before we do, we're going to answer 3 questions from the chat. And so here today, we've actually seen that a Russian diplomat has resigned. This Russian diplomat said he had never been so ashamed of his country and actually quit his job and made that official statement. So we're going to go to ABC News real quick, and while I don't like the mainstream news in general, they did release a pretty reasonable and pretty factual article here. And so a Russian diplomat in the UN office at Geneva handed in his resignation and sent out a scathing letter about the war going on in Ukraine and Vladimir Putin himself. And so the rest of the article talks about that. If you would like to read it in detail, make sure to click on the link to the map in the description below. And we also have a Discord server if you would like to join and talk to all of the great people in the Lee Spring Army. But as you can see here, it's just talking about the letter, and it's impressive to see that some Russians that, of course, get face serious consequences for what they're doing, like this man, are still taking stands and saying that what the Russians are doing is wrong. And it's good to know that there are people in Russia that actually see what's actually happening and know that it is, in fact, a wrong thing to do. And so with that, we've now covered all of the location unknown news and also all of our Russian news for today. And so before we move on to the Kharkiv news and also the northern Donbass news, we're going to answer 3 questions from the chat. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
All right, and hello everybody, it is Enforcer Matt with the questions. So first up, we have a $100 donation from Paolo Corradini, who says, "You've now live streamed 3 months of war. For those of us who stumbled upon your shows only halfway through or even recently, how would you say the conflict has evolved? Thank you guys, and Slava Ukraine."
Well, thank you very much for the support, Paolo. And also, I think this is a very interesting question for everyone to hear. So if you're one of those people who usually get out of here during the question segment, stick around if you're still around, because that's a great one. And I think that is an impressive question, honestly, because it's something that's never been covered before. To go and give a general summary, and this may take a few minutes, of how this war has progressed. And at the start, the Ukrainians were unprepared, at least officially. The Russians, of course, had forces in Belarus and all across the Ukrainian borders that were pretty much partnered right up with Russia. And once they launched the invasion, there were 2 main goals that they were going for: the besieging of Kyiv and the besieging of Kharkiv. The plan was to encircle both of these cities entirely and eventually starve them out and beat the defenders into submission to the point that the Ukrainian government would have a crisis on their hands where either they surrendered their power and allowed the nation to be annexed, or they let tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people die in deadly sieges. At least the other plan that it may seem that the Russians were going for is that they would besiege the cities, roll through them within a matter of a day or 2, and then they win, because they would have, of course, captured the Ukrainian government right in Kyiv, and the war would have been over. But as the days went by and the first week passed, that didn't happen. The Ukrainians stopped the Russians dead outside of Kyiv and also on the northern part of the ring road near Kharkiv. And so the Russians started to find themselves in a predicament that they didn't expect. The only place they made any kind of success over the first week was over the southern front. And most of the front lines you see down here on the southern front here on week 11 were actually the exact same front lines they nearly had on week 1. And that tells you how little progress they've made since then. They, of course, captured Kherson within the first few days. They pretty much blew through Melitopol and then pushed on up towards Tokmak within the next few days as well. And then they started to besiege Mariupol. And so Mariupol looks like it held out for a pretty good while. The rest of the southern front, of course, it collapsed except for near Mykolaiv, which became a front line at that time, as the Russians were trying to blow through Mykolaiv and get to Odessa to launch another naval invasion and capture that port city as well, and cut off the Ukrainians from the Black Sea altogether, and also cut off their coastline altogether. But they didn't get to achieve that because the defenders at Mykolaiv put up a pretty tough fight, along with the defenders at Kyiv and Kharkiv. And of course, you can't ever go without mentioning the smaller cities that were putting up unbelievable fights as well. For example, Chernihiv and Sumy were two of the other major battlegrounds at the start of this war that garnered a lot of attention because if those had been lost, they may have been major turning points in this war. And so then the weeks started to go by and things started to stall almost completely for the Russians in the north. No ground was being made anywhere. The Ukrainians were holding them back. And while the Ukrainians were holding them back fairly well, there was at least the possibility that the Russians may be able to turn things around, at least in everyone's eyes. Not mine, though. Of course, once you start a blitzkrieg and you get stopped dead in your tracks, you've lost the momentum and surprise that led to the initial success. And so you will eventually fall apart. So the Russians, after about a week or two, around the third week, they managed to break through near Irpin, and they actually cut off western Kyiv entirely. Paratroopers landed in Vasilkiv, Russian paratroopers, and a couple of the planes were shot down and killed hundreds of the paratroopers, but they actually did manage to encircle Kyiv on its western side entirely for around 2 weeks. Then the Ukrainians managed to do what was unbelievable. They launched a counterattack and completely broke this Russian encirclement on the western side. It was nearly a miracle in what it appeared to be. And they started a counterattack near Kyiv that started to push the Russians back out of the Bucha Hospital Irpin area. Due to a breach on the Irpin Dam, there was a massive floodplain, so thousands of Russians got stuck on the other side near Kyiv. The war started to go worse and worse for the Russians in the north. The 40-mile-long convoy did nothing to help them. It killed their logistics in the north entirely. They started to run out of supplies. There was tons of soldiers to feed, not enough food or ways to get the food to them. Also, the same thing started to occur in Chernihiv and Sumy, as the front lines pretty much started to fall apart there. We actually saw that at Sumy, counterattacks were being made and progress was actually happening. And we also saw up near Chernihiv that while the fight was still right on the outskirts of the city, the Russians were never making any more progress. They did manage to make that breakthrough, though, where they reached Brovary, but that's another story, and that was very light, because the Ukrainians were actually able to push them all the way back to Perluki within a week. So it wasn't like it was a massive Russian force on the eastern side. And then near Kharkiv, the situation started to fall apart there because the Ukrainians actually got encircled at Kharkiv for about 2 days, and then they found out that the supposed encirclement was a breakthrough convoy that was about the size of a BTG. They wiped the thing out, and then the encirclement, the official siege, was broken within 2 days. And so the front line stayed on the ring road for a bit, but here in the southern front, things stayed incredibly stagnant. The Russians, of course, controlled all of this land at that point. The Ukrainians had largely withdrawn all the way back to Severodonetsk then. But at the same time, nothing was really happening down there. And also, the fighting in Donetsk and Luhansk has nearly been stagnant the entire time because the defenses there are nearly like the modern-day Maginot Line for both sides. So it's really impossible to actually push the defenders on either side out of their positions because they're so well entrenched. Really, the only way to do that is to manage to make a breakthrough and get behind their lines where they're threatened with encirclement. And then they have to retreat. And that's why you see that this part of the front line that the Ukrainians controlled and this part of the front line that the Ukrainians controlled has now been abandoned because forces got behind them and threatened them with encirclement. So weeks started to pass, the situation started to stabilize down here, and everything started to become static. But up in the north, the Russians did so bad, they had to withdraw. And that was the major defeat that the Russians have faced so far, is that they literally had to give up half of the entire theater because it was going so bad. So they lost something like 10,000 troops up there, I believe, killed, probably around 40,000 wounded, and gained nothing out of it. All they did was manage to cause a little bit of a stir, and then they left. Down here in the Kharkiv area, everywhere in between Kharkiv to Mykolaiv, though, they started to bring down forces here and start to prepare for another counterattack. And so we're already talking about the end of month 2 and the beginning of month 3, and we're now starting off month 4 today. They began the offensive nearly at the beginning of month 3, which was 30 days ago, and for the past 4 weeks, they've been trying to push objectives down here in the south with little to no success. They had a minor breakthrough near Izium, and we do have information that they have pushed down to Kamyanka, at least. But beyond that, they've been stalled. And also, near Severodonetsk, they've been fighting for an entire month. An offensive has been going for a whole month, and they've just finally managed to reach the suburbs of Severodonetsk. And so the idea of an actual offensive, the way you would think about it in the modern world where they're incredibly quick and move fast, it's been going incredibly slow. The only areas we've seen them make breakthroughs so far in this entire front for this whole entire month in the offensive is near Lyman, where they've managed to push all the way through Torskay and to Lyman itself today. They've finally started fighting there in that city, and they've managed to make a breakthrough at Popasna and also Herskay, where they've pushed up to Rubivka. But they've been stopped there, and we know that heavy fighting is going on at Lyman right now. And so those are the only areas that the Russians have managed to push over the past month of an offensive. So in the picture of how this war has been panning out, it's been going incredibly poor for the Russians. Every time they're supposed to be making massive breakthroughs and progress, they're met with slow, grinding attrition. And it's just, it's not being won by them. I mean, like, it doesn't take an idiot to look at this kind of thing and go, this isn't going well for them, because people are still trying to insist that the Russians are going to pull some sort of rabbit out of the hat. But it's impossible at this point. It's been 3 months of fighting. They're now having to pull out T-62s, which are nearly 60 years old. 60-year-old tanks they're having to pull out to try and continue on this war, and they've lost half of the theater already. And so there's no way they can win. And considering that a month-long offensive that was supposed to take about a week has once again dragged out well beyond what it was supposed to be, it's telling us that the Russians have no chance. So, that was an incredibly long explanation, but I hope that does answer what we've been seeing over the past 3 months in a nutshell, and I do thank you very much for the support, Paolo Corradini. It does help out this channel a lot, and without y'all's support, this channel couldn't keep on running. And so I thank you all once again. It does help us out. And with that being said, I hope that answered the question. That's about the longest answer I think I've ever given, and with that, we're on to the next question.
And up next, we have a $50 donation from Putin, my butt when, who says, given the harsh international sanctions, do you think Putin will be able to prepare for when he suffers the same fate as Gaddafi?
Oh, that's a good question. Given the harsh sanctions, we already know that the Russians are going through a sugar and grain shortage, which is dire. Usually, most Western European diets and even Eastern European diets are largely consistent of wheat. That's something really interesting to me, is that while we've made large advances in making food more readily available, we still heavily rely on wheat. Like, think about it. Cheez-Its are made of wheat. You know, like here in the United States, just as an example. Cheez-Its are made of wheat. Nilla wafers are made of wheat. Nearly every kind of snack food you can imagine is made of wheat. Or potatoes. You know, potato chips are, of course, made of potato. Almost all of your sides, well, like hamburgers, you know, there's flour in them. Wheat, you know, the buns. So mostly grains, and we already know that they're going through massive food shortages pretty much just because of their lack of grains. So in that perspective, hunger is the leading factor that causes political unrest and infighting pretty much, because if people are starving, they get desperate and they'll do anything to eat, because people, that's the way you live, you got to eat. And so I would probably assume if the sanctions continued on for an incredibly long while and the Russians weren't able to fix the wheat situation alone, there may be massive civil unrest in the future in Russia, because people are going to be starving and desperate. So if the sanctions continued on for about a year, and this, well, 2 years probably, and this kind of famine continued, I guess you could say, where the Russians were lacking major amounts of wheat to feed their entire population, I think that would actually lead to the civil unrest that would lead to Putin turning into Gaddafi, you know, being Gaddafi'd, I guess you could say. So I thank you very much for the support. I hope that answers the question. And with that, we're going to answer the last question of this question segment, and then we're going to go over the Kharkiv and northern Donbass news. And so with that, who is the last person that got in a good question?
And the next one we have is from Junebug, who puts in a $37 donation and says, "Go Ukraine, yeehaw!"
Well, thank you very much for the support, and go Ukraine, yeehaw! And with that, I thank you so much for the support. I hope you like the yeehaw. And with that, we're now going to continue on with our Kharkiv and northern Donbass news and cover the situations going on there. Here in the Kharkiv area, we've actually seen the 228th Brigade, which is a territorial defense force, so it's actually the volunteers that were pretty much drawn up out of the country within the first week of the war. We can see that they've been busy. And when I mean busy, they have been busy. Here in this video, we can see that they've destroyed a multitude of Russian vehicles. Here we can see some kind of tank. I wasn't really sure what kind. We can now see what appears to be an abandoned MTLB, another abandoned MTLB, an abandoned SPG. We can now see them standing in front of a destroyed BMP-2. Here is another. What on earth was that? I don't even know what that is. For some reason, for a second, y'all, I actually thought that was a Panzer IV based off of what the front looked like. I have no idea what that could have been. It may have been an SPG. We can now see the barrel sticking out of the ground again. We can now see that they had a turret, a small turret, looks like a commander's cupola, with the 12.7 on top of it, the Dishka, I believe. Well, I think it's actually the KVT. I'm not particularly certain. We can see a T-72B, a TOS that's been abandoned in a field. And now you can see a strike being conducted on a Russian position. Now you can see the 228th wandering around, of course, wiping out Russians whenever and wherever they please. And that's the end of the video, and it's, of course, impressive to see that a territorial defense unit, which is just drawn up of the civilian population, has managed to inflict that much damage on the Russian contract soldiers. Because we do have information and confirmation to show that all of the soldiers that the Russians have been using in Ukraine, except for around 20,000 of them, have been contract soldiers. And so the Ukrainians are actually beating Russia's cream of the crop. So to explain the situation north of Kharkiv, there hasn't been any developments as of yet. It seems like the Ukrainians may have halted their offensive up here and have considered the situation largely under control, and they may be thinking that the amount of resources it would take to actually push this pocket and crush it may be too much for them to actually consider. So with that, that concludes our little Kharkiv segment, and we're now going to start moving past the Seversky Donetsk Reservoir. We haven't gotten any news from there. We're now going to be moving further down near the area of Chuhuiv, and also near Volokov Yar. We haven't gotten any news from here as well. It seems like the front line has largely become quiet and static in this area, as fighting has largely ceased. Once again, we've gotten no news out of the Izium area. It appears that the Russians, while starting up an artillery barrage last week, which may have suggested the resumption of offensive activities, we haven't seen any of those offensive activities unfold as of the moment. So it appears that that situation is largely static as well, and we're not really sure when the Russians will try another offensive from this area, if they're even ever going to try it again. So moving on beyond that, we've finally gotten some news from the Lyman area, which has been a little bit concerning, but hopefully the Ukrainians can take control of the situation and retake the initiative. Here on day 68, well, day 89, I'm sorry, correction, we can actually see shelling occur in the Lyman city, in Lyman city. Here in this clip, you can see that Ukrainians are inside of some kind of bunker, and you can hear the shelling going on outside.
Єбать! З Новим роком, нахуй! Єбать, вже пізда! Якісь йобнуті на голову, нахуй!
And so you can hear that the shelling, of course, was landing directly into the town. We also have drone footage of the Battle of Lyman as well from day 68. I'm sorry, correction, that's actually day 69 that I'm talking about. Here you can actually see on day 68 satellite footage showing ongoing fires within the area of Lyman, which may be suggesting where the fighting is. As we can see here on the northern and western side of the town, there's actually a large amount of fires going on, which may suggest that there is active fighting there. We can also see some scattered about fires around the rest of the city. One is actually inside of the rail yard, and that may be suggesting where artillery strikes have been conducted and have caused fires. So at the moment, on day 68, it appears that the Russians were able to break through the Ukrainian lines and a small breakthrough and finally reach the strategic town/city of Lyman. Just to give you an idea of why Lyman is a strategic town, Lyman is home to one of the largest rail yards in the area. You can actually see it here on the map. Of course, Ukraine doesn't rely on railroad logistics as heavily as the Russians, but railroad logistics are still incredibly important to their war effort, and we can see that the Russians have now ensured that this rail yard cannot be used at the moment because it is pretty much turning into an active battlefield. Here on day 69, we can actually see the Russians conducting massive MLRS barrages of the town. Here in this video, you can see around 8 MLRSs in one area firing at the same time towards Lyman. Here's the video.
Внимание! Залпом по 40 снарядов! 333!
And so you can see right there that the Russians are, of course, barraging the city incredibly heavily, I guess you could say. And also a quick correction. I'm saying day 69 a lot, nice, because day 69 for some reason got stuck in my head because it was one of those 48-hour days. And I think it was actually one of the first ones we did. So it's gotten stuck in my head now because I remember having to cover that 48-hour segment and cover 2 days at the same time. So if I'm saying day 69 within any of these Monday streams from here on, just know that I'm actually probably talking about the day before today. So when I say day 69, I'm actually talking about day 89. So just covering myself in the future because for some reason that one's stuck in my head. And we're now going to move down to the city of Lyman once more. And here on day 90, we can see the battle for Lyman unfolding here on this drone footage. Of course, it's a bit of a short clip, but you can see the MLRS fire that may have been fired from the Russians in that last clip landing, as the amount of artillery fire is massive. Hundreds of rockets landing at the same time. And you can see some fires and plumes of smoke billowing out of the town, which does suggest that this is most likely under attack right now, and the Ukrainians and the Russians are fighting within the actual city itself. So, the situation here seems a little bit tough. The Russians managed to break through from the village of Torske up here, just a little bit north of Lyman. And just to give you all a perspective of how large this Russian push was to actually make it to Lyman, they managed to cover a whopping 5 miles. Now, and of course I'm being sarcastic when I say whopping. Whopping isn't anything impressive. We've seen the Ukrainians cover 10 miles 2 days in a row and reach Stary Saltiv, so this isn't anything of a massive breakthrough. But at the same time, the Russians have now made it to a strategic center here in the, I guess you could call it Severodonetsk Bulge, if you'd like to call it that. And so if the Russians are able to capture Lyman, they will also have connection to one of the major highways that leads to Slovyansk and also to Bakhmut as well. This also, if they were able to manage to get on the T-0513 and reach Seversk, would jeopardize the Ukrainian logistical situation to a large degree, and if the Russians were able to manage another breakthrough here and reach the T-1302 highway, then that means that they would actually be putting the Ukrainian logistics situation on Severodonetsk and Lysychansk at a complete freeze, as no supplies would be able to get through to those defenders, and they would pretty much have to start working off of borrowed time until the Ukrainians were able to reopen one of these highways, or manage to find some other way to send supplies to them. So the situation is looking a little bit tough. It does seem like the Ukrainians may be able to hold the Russians in Lyman for a time. We're not really sure. The situation is still unfolding and it's very new, so it's very hard to tell what's actually going on there. But hopefully the Ukrainians can manage to hold the city of Lyman and push them back towards Torske again, so that way they can ensure that this vital railway hub is not controlled by the Russians, and also ensure that Ukrainian logistics to Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and also the situation near Slovyansk is not threatened. We're now going to be moving into Severodonetsk and Lysychansk itself, where we can see today, well actually yesterday on day 89, that Ukrainian soldiers took a rest. It's a very interesting video to see because, of course, we don't see a lot of videos of the Ukrainians just living their daily lives after, they're fighting. So here we can see them inside of a bunker, or a basement.
Чекаємо.
So you can see them resting. It's very interesting to see, and they look incredibly tired. So hopefully they get a good amount of rest and can go back up to the front lines and not be groggy. Because, of course, being sleepy will affect how well you fight to a point, because if you get so sleepy, you may stop paying attention, get careless, and get killed or wounded. So hopefully they can get well rested before they are sent back up to the lines. And back in Lysychansk today, we've actually seen that an oil depot was hit and is on fire. The Russians, of course, are trying to damage Ukraine's oil refineries and also their ability to, I guess you could say, fuel their army as best as possible. And here we can see another example of that, as this oil refinery has been hit and is burning. So hopefully the Ukrainian oil situation doesn't get any worse. We actually do know that the Ukrainians are going through an oil shortage at the moment, as it is getting very hard for civilians to find oil around Ukraine, and also the sale of gas is being limited at gas stations now due to the pretty much shortages that are happening around the country. hopefully that situation can be fixed. I'm not really sure how a fix would be reached, considering that most Western European countries at this point are starting to have rising oil and gas prices. And so I'm not really sure how they'll fix that, but it is a situation that the Ukrainians are starting to face. Moving on further down the front, towards the area of Bila Hora, we can see the 80th Brigade destroy some more Russian vehicles. Of course, with a Stupna.
Що? Пусть дозволено.
We can now see that they fired the rocket, and the rocket is on the way. I call it a rocket, but it's a missile. We can see that they're now tracking the vehicle. We can also see a helicopter flying in a bit of the screen right there.
Yes! Yeah. Yes.
And we can see that they hit it. Of course, an impressive hit, and we can see that the Ukrainian crew was, of course, very cheerful about it. Let's listen to him again.
Yes! Yeah. Yes. Все.
They sounded pretty excited, and of course, it's always great to hear that their excitement come through, because defending their country, of course, must be a great feeling, and of course, they should be proud of what they're doing. So we're now going to move on to the next bit of news here from the northern Luhansk area, where we've seen an interesting sight. Both of these videos occurred near the village of Toshkivka today, which is in Russian hands. Here we can see a Ka-52 firing rockets into the distance, of course using its standard upward angle of fire that we've always seen in all of these videos of helicopters being used. Here's the video. You can see the helicopters being fired upwards and the Ka-52 now going back down to the deck to fly off. And you now hear the sound of those rockets being fired. And not only did a Ka-52 fire off its rockets in that one area, Russian Su-25s then followed up that rocket barrage with a rocket barrage of their own in the exact same area, filmed by the exact same guy in the exact same spot. Here's the video of the two Su-25s firing off their rockets. We can now see the Su-25s popping flares. We can now hear the sound of the rockets firing, and they are now hitting the ground and trying to fly out of there. And so by the amount of rocket barrages alone near this village of Toshkivka, we're not really sure which direction it was aimed at, but it may have been aimed directly at Lysychansk or Severodonetsk, which may indicate that a large Russian push was being planned to have been carried out at that time. Otherwise, a barrage like that would be wasteful. Then again, the Russians are wasteful in general. We're then going to move down to the last bit of news we have in the northern Donbass, and then we're going to go through our next 3 questions segment, and then cover the rest of the news we have around the country. And so our last bit of news actually comes directly from the T-1302 highway, where we've seen some journalists come under fire on the way to Lysychansk. As we see, they're driving down the road, and right here, we can see a shell land into the water of what it appears to be a river and explode a large spout of water upwards into the air. We can now see another artillery shell land on the other side of the road. And we see these journalists are trying to floor it through this area and get out of the artillery fire as fast as possible. We can now see that they've gotten out of the car and they've hit the ditch. When you hear the artillery shells literally whistling over them, which is telling us that the fire is incredibly close. Let's hear that again. We can actually see the plume from that explosion right over the hilltop. When you hear the next rounds coming in, it seems like they hit further down the road. And that's the end of the video, a very harrowing video. You hardly hear the scream of the shells as they fly in, and that tells you how close these journalists were to certain death. And so it's incredible. It's great to know that they managed to make it through, but a harrowing video nonetheless. And it is showing that the T-1302, while being an open highway to Lysychansk, is still very dangerous. And I'm sure that the logistics drivers that are driving the logistics trucks to supply the forces up at Lysychansk and Severodonetsk are having harrowing experiences driving up and down that highway, trying to deliver the vital supplies needed to carry on this war. So, with that in mind, and that being said, let's keep in mind the logistics drivers and truckers that keep this war running for the Ukrainians and make sure that the defenses stay strong, because they do too run into peril every here and there, like on the T-1302. And with that, we've now reached the end of the Kharkiv and northern Donbass news. And so before we move on to Svitlodarsk and also the rest of the news around the country, along with Zelensky's speech, we're going to stop to take another three questions from the chat. And hopefully they're as good as the first ones, because we had a great question from Paolo Corradini at the start. And so hopefully we can have some very interesting ones that reveal very interesting answers. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
Okay, and up next we have a $20 donation from Raphael Schneeves, who says, what do you think of the idea of Ukraine building biplanes for ground attack or scouting, being built with wood or aluminum and being covered with fabric, using modified Stugna P or other ATGM weapons systems? God bless.
Well, thank you very much for the support, and I think that's something I would generally shoot down. While propeller planes, of course, well, prop planes, I guess you could call them, still do have a place in the battlefield. For example, the Super Tucano, which we can pull up, is a 4th generation propeller aircraft. I believe it's actually designed by the Brazilians, and it has a perfect place in the battlefield. It has a long loiter time, and it's able to carry most of the modern munitions that an A-10 Warthog can carry. Not